November 1870, San Francisco, California. Two grizzled prospectors walk into a banker's office after hours, carrying a grubby leather bag they refuse to open in front of anyone. Inside, a fortune in uncut diamonds, or so they claim, supposedly scraped straight out of the American wilderness. Within 2 years, this bag will con some of the sharpest financial minds in the country out of hundreds of thousands of dollars, using nothing but dirt, patience, and a jeweler who'd never actually handle the raw diamond in his life. Meet Philip Arnold and John Slack. Arnold, a former Confederate soldier turned failed gold prospector, and his cousin Slack had spent years scraping by in the mountains without much to show for it. What they did learn, watching California's gold rush and Nevada's silver boom reshape fortunes around them, was that people believe exactly what they want to believe when enormous profits are on the table. Their pitch to San Francisco businessman George Roberts was simple and deliberately vague: a bag of gems found somewhere out west, value undisclosed. Roberts couldn't keep the secret to himself, and word reached William Ralston, founder of the Bank of California. Ralston and his associates pressed the two prospectors until they admitted they'd stumbled onto an enormous, untouched diamond field. Before committing serious money, the investors wanted independent verification. They sent a sample of the stones to New York, to Charles Louis Tiffany himself, founder of Tiffany Company. There was just one problem nobody accounted for. Tiffany's expertise was in finished, cut gemstones, not raw, uncut ones fresh out of the ground. He and his assistant examined the sample and confidently valued it at $150,000, a figure wildly higher than what the stones were actually worth. That single overestimate did more to legitimize the fraud than anything Arnold and Slack could have said themselves. Word of the find spread far enough that the London banking house of Rothschild expressed genuine interest, and one of its agents, Albert Ganzel, was added directly to the new mining company's board of directors. Investors insisted on inspecting the actual diamond field before committing further, so they brought in Henry Janin, a mining engineer with a reputation for having never once made a costly mistake across hundreds of inspections. In June 1872, Janin and a small group of investors traveled by train into Wyoming territory, then rode on horseback for 4 days into the wilderness, blindfolded for the final stretch so they couldn't retrace the route themselves. They arrived at a remote mesa straddling the Colorado-Wyoming border and began digging. Diamonds turned up almost immediately, along with rubies, emeralds, and sapphires, scattered across the ground in astonishing quantities. Janin was completely convinced, estimating the field could yield $1 million a month. He was so confident, in fact, that he quietly sold off shares of his own company stock before anyone else caught on, walking away with roughly $30,000 regardless of what happened next. The unraveling started almost by accident. Clarence King, a Yale-trained geologist already leading a separate federal survey of the region, crossed paths with Janin and grew suspicious of the claims on his own initiative. King examined the site himself and reached a conclusion no amount of investor enthusiasm could argue with. Diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and sapphires simply don't occur together naturally in a single deposit. Some of the stones even bore visible cutting marks, evidence they'd been shaped by a diamond cutter's tools long before ever touching that hillside. The field hadn't produced a single genuine discovery. It had been salted, seeded deliberately with real gemstones Arnold had bought cheaply in London on repeated overseas trips. The hoax became public in late November 1872, and the mining company dissolved within days. When investigators eventually tracked Arnold down back home in Kentucky, he settled out of court, repaying only a fraction of what he'd taken. Slack was never located. Decades later, one researcher would claim to have traced him to a quiet life as an undertaker in New Mexico, but at the time, he simply vanished. Arnold used his share of the money to buy a house and hundreds of acres back in Kentucky, all of it registered in his wife's name to keep it out of reach of future lawsuits. Two failed prospectors managed to fool a jeweler who didn't know his own trade, a mining engineer who profited on the way out the door, and some of the wealthiest financial names on 2 continents, using nothing but a hole in the ground and everyone's shared belief that the next great American fortune was always just one lucky strike away.